A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was looking at a photo of Albert Einstein the other day, and he looks just how you would expect. The wild hair, the deep-set eyes, the look of a man who is currently recalculating the curvature of space-time. But then I saw another photo of him on a tiny sailboat, looking completely lost, and it hit me that we have this totally skewed vision of what genius actually looks like in practice. We imagine these people as monolithic machines of productivity, but the reality is much more chaotic and, frankly, a lot more relatable.
It's a persistent myth. This idea of the lonely figure chained to a desk, grinding away 24 hours a day until a light bulb goes off. Herman Poppleberry here, and today's prompt from Daniel is about how these historic giants actually spent their downtime. He wants us to look at how people like Einstein and Isaac Newton unwound, and the reality is much weirder and more instructive than the myth. We often talk about their breakthroughs as if they happened in a vacuum of pure labor, but if you look at the journals and the biographies, the breakthroughs almost always happen when they were doing something else entirely.
It feels like we are obsessed with optimization now. Especially in 2026. Every minute has to be productive, every hobby has to be a side hustle, and if you aren't crushing it, 16 hours a day, you're falling behind. But when you look at the people who actually changed the world, they spent a shocking amount of time doing things that looked like a complete waste of time to an outside observer. They weren't just resting, they were playing.
That is the genius paradox. The most productive minds in history were often the ones who spent the most time doing nothing, or at least nothing related to their primary work. We have seen some compelling science on this recently that validates these historical anecdotes. In late 2025, there was a major meta-analysis of 22 different workplace studies that found workers who took intentional short breaks had a 60% higher chance of reporting increased energy and reduced fatigue. That is a massive margin for something as simple as stepping away from a screen.
60% is not just a rounding error. That is a fundamental shift in how the brain operates. It makes me think that our modern, always-on culture is actually a form of cognitive sabotage. We think we're getting more done, but we're just draining the battery without ever letting it recharge.
It really comes down to something called the default mode network, or the DMN. When you stop focusing on a specific demanding task, your brain doesn't just turn off. It switches into this idle state that is actually a high processing mode for creative synthesis. Think of it like a computer running background updates. The Society for the Neuroscience of Creativity had a whole symposium on this in 2025, and they highlighted a study from Scientific Reports in the journal Nature. They found that greater mind wandering during what they call creative incubation actually predicts measurable improvements in how people solve complex problems.
So when Einstein was out on his boat, he wasn't just avoiding work. His brain was actually doing the heavy lifting in the background while he was trying not to capsize. It's like he was giving his conscious mind a break, so his subconscious could finally get a word in edgewise.
You're right. Einstein is the poster child for what the physicist Carlo Rovelli calls loafing aimlessly. In his book 7 Brief Lessons on Physics, Rovelli points out that before one of his most productive periods, Einstein spent roughly an entire year just drifting. He wasn't at a prestigious university, he was just existing. He loved his violin, which he nicknamed Lena. He started playing at 6, and he discovered Mozart at 13. He famously said that if he weren't a physicist, he would probably be a musician. He would play Mozart to clear his head when he hit a mathematical wall.
I love the idea of him calling his violin Lena. It makes it feel like a partnership. But the sailing is my favorite part because he was notoriously terrible at it. You'd think the man who understood the fundamental laws of the universe could handle a rudder, but apparently not.
He really couldn't. There are reports of him being rescued by the police after drifting off Long Island because he just couldn't get the boat back to shore. But here is the key part. He chose small, slow boats on purpose. He didn't want a speedboat or something complex. He wanted something that moved slowly and couldn't go far because it forced a slower pace of thought. He would sit there with a black notebook, wait for the DMN to kick in, and wait for the universe to start making sense. He was essentially creating a sensory deprivation chamber out on the water.
It is a deliberate slowing down. In a world that wants everything at light speed, he was choosing the slowest possible mode of transport. It's a beautiful contrast to the work he's famous for. We talked about this a bit back in episode 1040, when we did the deep dive into relativity. We focused on the math then, but the how of the math is just as important. He needed that silence.
He did. And he wasn't the only one who used play as a primary tool. Richard Feynman is another great example. He was a Nobel laureate in physics, worked on the Manhattan Project, but if you asked him what he did, he would probably mention the bongo drums first. He played them his entire life. His close friend Ralph Layton even co-authored a book about their adventures. When Feynman was on sabbatical in Brazil, he didn't just hang out at the beach, he joined a samba school.
I remember reading about that. He played the frigideira, right? That little metal percussion instrument that looks like a small frying pan.
That is the one. He was actually chosen over local musicians to play in the carnival parade because he was that good. And it wasn't just music. He took up drawing and painting under a pseudonym, Ofé. He even had an exhibition of his work in a strip club. He famously quipped during a lecture at Cornell in 1964 that people who introduce him never seem to find it necessary to mention that he also does theoretical physics. He wanted to be known for his curiosity, not just his credentials.
He was the ultimate amateur. He had this childlike curiosity that he refused to let go of. And the crazy thing is that his greatest scientific breakthrough came directly from a moment of pure, unproductive play.
You are thinking of the spinning plate in the Cornell cafeteria.
That's the one. He was just sitting there, feeling burnt out, and he saw someone toss a plate into the air. He noticed that the red Cornell medallion on the plate was spinning faster than the wobble of the plate itself. He didn't have to figure out why. It had zero practical application for his work at the time. But he was bored and decided to play with the equations of rotating wobbles just for fun. He wasn't trying to win a Nobel Prize. He was just trying to solve a puzzle that caught his eye.
That play led directly to the equations for electrodynamics that won him the Nobel Prize. He had been feeling like he had lost his edge, but by giving himself permission to do something useless, he unlocked the very thing that made him world famous. It is a powerful argument for the idea that non-serious curiosity is the fuel for serious work. If he had been optimizing his lunch hour, he would have ignored the plate and gone back to his office to stare at a blank chalkboard.
It makes me wonder about the difference between someone like Feynman and someone like Isaac Newton, because Newton doesn't exactly strike me as a guy who played the bongos or went sailing for fun. He seems much more intense.
Newton is the fascinating counterpoint. He didn't really unwind in the modern sense. His hobbies were what I would call obsessive parallel fixations. He didn't have a switch-off button, he just switched the topic. When he wasn't inventing calculus or figuring out gravity, he was knee-deep in alchemy and biblical cryptography. He spent decades on alchemy, often in secret because it was technically illegal. When he died, he had 169 books on alchemy in his personal library.
Alchemy feels like a very stressful hobby. You're dealing with toxic chemicals and trying to turn lead into gold in a basement. That doesn't exactly sound like a relaxing weekend.
It was incredibly intense. We actually know now that he probably suffered from mercury poisoning because of it. When they tested his hair posthumously, the mercury levels were off the charts. He also spent an enormous amount of energy trying to derive the exact floor plan of Solomon's temple from biblical texts, believing it held the blueprint for the universe. So for Newton, a break was just a different kind of obsession. It wasn't about emptying the mind like Einstein, it was about filling it with something else.
It's like an athlete who cross-trains. You are resting your running muscles by swimming, but you are still working hard. It seems like a dangerous way to live, though. Einstein's way feels much more sustainable. I mean, the mercury poisoning alone is a pretty big mark in the cons column for Newton's approach.
Definitely. But it shows the range of how these minds operate. Then you have someone like Charles Darwin, whose method was much more meditative and rhythmic. He had what he called his sand walk at Down House in Kent. It was a gravel path, and he would walk it every single day at the same time.
I've always liked the image of the sandwalk. It is so deliberate. It's not just a stroll, it's a ritual.
He would actually place a pile of flint stones at the start of the path. Every time he completed a lap, he would kick a stone away so he didn't have to keep track of the count in his head. He would just pace and pace, sometimes for hours. That was where the theory of evolution really took shape. The rhythmic motion of walking is a known trigger for the DMN. It occupies the motor cortex just enough to keep you from overthinking, but leaves the rest of the brain free to wander.
It is a physical anchor for a wandering mind. It's notable how many of these people had a physical component to their downtime. Darwin had his walks and his beetle collecting. He was obsessed with beetles from his youth. He once reportedly carried over 1,600 specimens home in his jacket pockets after a single trip in South America. Can you imagine the rustling sound of 1,600 beetles in your coat?
That is a staggering number of beetles, corn.
It really is. And then you have Marie Curie and her husband Pierre. Their idea of a break was long-distance cycling. They were pioneers in that too. Their honeymoon was actually a cycling tour of France. They bought the bicycles with money they received as a wedding gift from a cousin. This was in the late 1800s, so we're talking about heavy, single-speed bikes on unpaved roads.
They took regular trips through the Cevennes Mountains and along the Channel coast. And for Marie, it wasn't just exercise. It was a quiet act of social defiance. In that era, women's sports were often frowned upon, and here she was, one of the most brilliant scientists in history, pedaling through the French countryside in her bloomers. She used those trips to clear her head of the literal and metaphorical clouds of her laboratory work. It was a way to reclaim her body and her mind from the intensity of the lab.
It is that same theme of physical engagement. Even Nikola Tesla had his version of this, though his was a bit more eccentric. He had this incredibly deep bond with the pigeons in New York City. He would spend hours in the parks feeding them, and he would even bring injured birds back to his hotel room at the Hotel New Yorker to nurse them. He famously wrote about one specific white pigeon that he said he loved as a man loves a woman.
Tesla is always the one who takes things to the next level of weird, but it served the same purpose. It was an emotional and mental outlet that had nothing to do with alternating current or wireless power. It gave his brain a different frequency to tune into. What strikes me about all these stories is that none of these people treated their hobbies as something they had to be good at in a professional sense. Einstein was a bad sailor. Feynman was a physicist playing drums in a strip club. They weren't looking for more achievement, they were looking for an escape from the pressure of achievement.
That is a huge lesson for us today. We are so conditioned to believe that if we aren't getting better at something, it is a waste of time. If you take up painting, you feel like you have to take a class and eventually sell your work. If you start running, you have to track your pace and heart rate on a watch. We have optimized the joy out of our leisure time, and in doing so, we might be killing our creativity.
We have turned play into work, and by doing that, we are actually shutting down the very cognitive processes that lead to breakthroughs. If your break involves the same kind of goal-oriented, high-focus effort as your job, you aren't actually giving your DMN a chance to kick in. You are just switching from one demanding task to another. It's like trying to rest by doing a different kind of push-up.
So, how do we actually apply this? If someone is listening to this and they are feeling that burnout, that mental block, what is the sandwalk method for a modern professional?
The first step is to schedule unproductive time. That sounds like an oxymoron, but it is necessary. You have to carve out blocks where the only goal is to not have a goal. Whether that is a long walk without a podcast, sorry to our listeners, or playing an instrument poorly, or just sitting on a slow boat if you can find one. The key is that it has to be a low cognitive load activity, something repetitive and rhythmic.
It is about finding that sweet spot where your body is busy, but your mind is free. That is why gardening or woodworking or even folding laundry can be so meditative. You are doing something, but you aren't solving a problem. You're letting the background updates run.
And we shouldn't be afraid of boredom. We have become so allergic to boredom that we fill every gap with a screen. But boredom is the waiting room for creativity. When you are bored, your brain starts looking for its own entertainment, and that is when the weird connections start happening. Einstein's year of loafing wasn't a gap in his life, it was the foundation for everything that came after. We talked about the importance of rest in episode 1160 when we covered power pods and naps, but this is a different flavor of recovery. This is active incubation.
It is also worth noting that these breaks don't have to be long to be effective. That 2025 meta-analysis you mentioned showed that even short, intentional breaks make a difference. You don't need a year off. You might just need 15 minutes where you aren't checking your notifications. A 60% energy boost for 15 minutes of nothing is the best return on investment you will ever find.
We often think we don't have time to take a break, but the reality is we don't have time not to. The cost of staying on all the time is a kind of cognitive stagnation. You are just grinding the same gears until they wear down. You need the intense, focused on time to gather the data and define the problem, but you need the off time to actually solve it. It is like a digestive process for the mind. You can't just keep eating information. You have to give your brain time to break it down and integrate it.
I think my favorite takeaway from this is the idea of being bad at something on purpose. There is something incredibly liberating about being a Nobel-winning physicist who is also a terrible sailor. It humanizes these giants. They weren't perfect machines. They were people who needed to play. They were better at their jobs because they played. Feynman's Cornell cafeteria plate is the ultimate proof of that.
It really is. It's a good reminder for all of us. Whether you are a developer, a writer, a teacher, or a student, your best work probably isn't going to happen while you are staring at a screen. It is going to happen when you are out for a walk, or playing the drums, or maybe just watching a pigeon in the park. We should all find our version of the sandwalk. Something repetitive, something rhythmic, something that lets the stones do the counting while our minds do the wandering.
I might skip the mercury-laden alchemy, though. That one feels like a niche interest for a very specific kind of genius with a very sturdy central nervous system. I'll stick to the violin.
Probably for the best. Stick to the music, Corn. It is much safer. We have covered a lot of ground today, from the high seas with Einstein to the bongo drums of Brazil. It is a revealing look at the mental architecture of the human mind and how it actually functions when we aren't trying to force it.
It really is. And it gives us a lot to think about in terms of how we structure our own lives and work. If it weren't for the people who discovered evolution and relativity, it is probably a valid strategy for the rest of us. Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the graphics processing unit credits that power the generation of this show.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are enjoying these deep dives into the quirks of history and science, a quick review on your podcast app really helps us reach new listeners who might be looking for a reason to take a break themselves. What is your sandwalk? Let us know on the socials.
Go find your slow boat today. We will see you next time.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to